Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And if you have not already done so, please silence your cell phones. Today is April 13th, the birthday of Eudora Welty. Stop by the Welty House after History's Lunch for a free tour and celebratory cupcakes from Campbell's Bakery. And I hope that you'll join us next Wednesday for History's Lunch when Thomas Michael Curson will present Communes and Counterculture in the Magnolia State. That program will be co-sponsored by our friends at the Mississippi Humanities Council, where Dr. Curson is a member of their Speakers Bureau. And if you have not looked through that online list, it's worth you knowing about. And then please come back here this Friday at 2 p.m. when Joseph Iwudzi and Carla Shedd will discuss his new book, Getting Something to Eat in Jackson, Race, Class, and Food in the American South. Iwudzi is an associate professor of sociology at Davidson, and Carla Shedd is an associate professor of sociology at the City University of New York. She is also the daughter of Virgia Brox Shedd, who was a founding member of the Society of Mississippi Archivists, the first black woman appointed to the Mississippi Library Commission, and a longtime librarian at Tougaloo College. Many of you will know her. Iwudzi and Shedd will be in conversation with some of the Jacksonians portrayed in the book, and we'll have finger foods and appetizers by Chef Enrica Williams, and the book will be for sale, and he'll be signing after. So please come to that. It should be a really good program. Today's program is co-sponsored by the Mississippi Humanities Council and is part of the department's year-long initiative, along with the Mississippi Museum of Art, exploring the Great Migration. Remember that exhibit, A Movement in All Directions, has opened last weekend at the Art Museum. If you have not seen it, that is well worth your time as well. Deborah Douglas is with us to present Forth and Back, the Great Migration Roadmap to Resistance and Reclamation. Before we hear from Deborah, we have John Spann from the Mississippi Humanities Council who will say a few words, and then Sarah Campbell, who is Director of Programs and Publications for the Department of Archives and History, will introduce Deborah Douglas. Help me welcome John Spann.
Good afternoon. My name is John Spann. I serve as the Program and Outreach Officer for the Mississippi Humanities Council. The Humanities Council is pleased to sponsor today's presentation by Deborah Douglas, author of the New Moon Guidebook, U.S. Civil Rights Trail as Traveler's Guide to the People, Places, and Events that Made the Movement. Throughout 2022, the Mississippi Humanities Council is marking its 50th anniversary, serving the people and the cultural organizations of our state with programs and events that reflect our diverse stories. As part of its anniversary observation, the Council is encouraging and supporting programs like this that inspire Mississippians to think about our state's narratives, have and how they reflect or fail to reflect who we are and where we've been. The primary objectives of the Council are to further public knowledge of the humanities, to encourage reasonable public discourse, to foster critical thinking, to strengthen our sense of community, and to promote understanding of all cultural heritage. Our grants are available to all nonprofit, including civic organizations, libraries, church groups, historical societies, schools, colleges, and universities. And we are proud to be here today to sponsor this event. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Campbell, and my friend, Deborah Douglas, was born in Chicago and reared in Detroit and Memphis. We met as young reporters at the Clarion Ledger in the early 1990s, and here is Debbie in a photo from that time in front of a quilt made by her grandmother in my side yard. And Debbie was covering Madison County at the time, which is where her people come from. Debbie's writing, editing, and teaching career has taken her many places, including the Chicago Sun-Times and MLK 50, Justice Through Journalism, Northwestern University, DePauw University, and now Boston University. Debbie is the co-editor-in-chief of The Emancipator, which I hope she'll tell us more about. Help me welcome Debbie Douglas.
Can you hear me? Great. Thank you so much for having me. I love being in Mississippi. I had a really nice meal at Sarah's house last night, and it tasted really good. It tasted better than food in Boston. I was told that there was somebody in this room who said that the topic of the Great Migration is a big topic, and it is. But I'm going to make it small and compact and personal and intimate about my family, and hopefully by the end we all feel like family too, okay? So I'm going to start off by reading to you a poem by Langston Hughes. It's called One-Way Ticket. I pick up my life and take it with me, and I put it down in Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, Scranton, any place that is north and east and not Dixie. I pick up my life and take it on the train to Los Angeles, Bakersfield, Seattle, Oakland, Salt Lake, any place that is north and west and not south. I am fed up with Jim Crow laws, people who are cruel and afraid, who lynch and run, who are scared of me and me of them. I pick up my life and take it away on a one-way ticket, gone up north, gone out west, gone. Thank you. So, I am a child of the Great Migration. As Sarah just said, I was born in Chicago. I started school in post-uprising Detroit. And on the road back between those cities and my parents' ancestral homes near Memphis, a small town called Covington, Tennessee, and Madison County, just up north, I was just as at home on I-55 and I-75 as in my neighborhood. So, you're in this room now at this beautiful museum that honors our history, and it's one of the best I've seen, and I think I've seen them all. But how many of you have a Great Migration story in your life? How many of you have worked up north for some reason and ended up coming back here, or have family who left? Raise your hands. Okay, anybody over here? Okay, got it. It's a common story. So growing up, for me, it was my mother who regaled me with stories about growing up down south. If I can get this picture. This is down south to me. That's my grandmother, Mary, my grandfather, Ike. That used to be my brother, Paul. We found out he wasn't my brother. Don't ask me how that happened, but we love him anyway. And me, and that's in Madison County. That's in Tennessee, up there in the corner. It was at my grandfather's funeral, and we were all on the front porch, crowded up together, taking a picture, us little cousins meeting each other for the first time. We're so much more than cousins, though. We're siblings. And there's my unbrother, Paul, again. My mother told stories about getting up before sunup to hop on the back of my grandfather's rickety old Ford pickup truck to haul the kids to pick and chop cotton. There were 11 of them. I really didn't get the appeal. I'm like, why do you keep telling me this story? But it was something about the memories of a family working together to keep a roof over their heads and feed themselves that made her beam. It made her glow. I couldn't quite put it together until I got older and I started traveling to other places around the world where I could see how other people lived. Then my family was actually living like in a subsistence sort of condition. But they didn't know that because they were together and they had love, and there was really anything about what they didn't have. It was about what they did have. What earnings my mother didn't give to her parents, she spent on snacks and comic books, which I can attribute my comic book fixation to. All the kids had to chip in for the family to survive. My mother, Ernestine, and my aunts told me they didn't know they were poor until they graduated high school and moved to Chicago, and then it became clear. My uncles, not all of them went up north, but the ones who did, Lester, Robert, and Jerome, they talked little about their childhoods. The men talked less about their childhoods. And when they did talk about it, they talked about work. It was all about work and more work. So while my parents were divorced, I made the trek down south with them separately. My dad never drove a new car because he fixed cars for a living, so he was always fixing one up. And so he and his wife and their 2 children together would often scoop me up at my maternal grandmother's house, just north of Memphis, and bring me down here to Madison County to get to know and, get to know my family, my paternal side. And those trips with him, they remind me of a story about my half-sister, Yolanda. You know how kids go, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" More family pictures. Well, this time, Yolanda was like, "Are we at Mississippi yet? Are we at Mississippi yet?" And we're like, "We haven't even gotten to Kankakee yet. What are you talking about? We just got started." And then we get to Missouri, and she's like, "Are we at Mississippi yet?" And I'm like, "No, baby, we're gonna be there soon. We'll let you know as soon as we get there." So of course, as soon as we get to the state line, and there's a big Mississippi sign, we're like, we're here, we're at Mississippi. And she was like, And we're like, okay, what was that about? So it wasn't until hours later that we're on Highway 43, and we're driving up to my grandmother's driveway. The wheels are crackling on the gravel. Crackly, 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 crackly. I'm looking around to see what animals are around in the dark. And Yolanda said, "We're at Mississippi," because Mississippi was literally home. My favorite trips, my all-time favorite trips, were with my Aunt Virgie and my Uncle Bill, mostly because of the food my Aunt Virgie packed. She would make her signature chicken salad that she made with Thousand Island dressing, and she boiled the chicken herself, over many, many hours, so it was really good and really yummy. And she made other really great snacks. But even though we had food, we always stopped in Missouri at Boomland. And I don't know if you've ever been to Boomland. Anybody been to Boomland? You gotta go to Boomland. Because you never knew if you needed another set of salt and pepper shakers, some pot holders, some lottery tickets. And Boomland has really great bacon. And if you have salt sensitivity, though, don't eat it. So my Uncle Bill, he got dibs on choosing the music. So have you been on the road? Who gets to choose the music when you're on the road? Who? The driver? Daddy? Uncle Bill got to choose the music. The rules of the road dictated that the driver pick the music. So he really liked R&B, a lot of Marvin Gaye, a lot of Aretha, and blues music. And let's see if I can find this song. You guys, can we hear this? Okay, I had a song embedded. Ooh, there it is. That's Riding in the Car with Uncle Bill.
She said your party's jumping and everybody's having a good time. And you know what's going through my mind. Do you mind if I get comfortable?
Okay. So that's what it was like riding the car with Aunt Virgie and Uncle Bill. And it was always really loud because he worked at the factory all week, and we were always getting shoved in the car at the last minute. And so we had to drive through the night, and he had to play it loud so he could stay awake. And those were the rules of the road. My mom's meals, my mom lived in Detroit, so that's a different trek. That's down 75. And her meals are more traditional. You're likely to open up your bag or your box, depending on how she chose to pack it. She had more traditional traveling while black fare. So that would be chicken, 2 slices of bread, some pound cake. We're all familiar with that one. Yeah. So she always made sure to pack me grapes when we were on the road. Oops, sorry. I missed that picture. She always made sure to pack me grapes while on the road because a lot of times we spend a lot of time on Greyhound and on Amtrak, but mostly on Greyhound. I kind of feel like I grew up on Greyhound. I could point to every water tower along I-55 and every on I-75. I know where the McDonald's test kitchen is. I tasted chicken nuggets before all of you, so you can thank me for that. We're always zipping between Chicago, Detroit, Tennessee, Mississippi, but she figured out grapes were a really great way to quench my thirst without having to give me water. Because another key rule of the road is to avoid giving the driver too many reasons to stop to go to the bathroom, right? So grapes, that's my cheat code for getting a little, liquid in there so I can keep going. So growing up in the big city, it seemed like every kid had a story about a place down south, though. We would sit on our front stoop, we'd be counting cars or playing jacks or bending over and studying ants working. I stopped killing the ants when my mother told me that I had malice in my heart, and I had to look that up in the dictionary, and I didn't kill them no more. But we would talk about our cousins down south in Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi, and we would compare slang terms. Well, my cousin says this, and we say this up here, and they say that, but we say this. And then we would decide who had the best slang terms. And to hear us, you would think, when talking about our families, you would think that we were from different countries. Like, we didn't make the connection that Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama, kind of the same place. I mean, for all intents and purposes, we just thought it was so different. We were so sure of our individual families' reasons for being down south or deciding to come up north had something only to do with them and nothing else, no larger context. We had no clue. And for some reason, nobody told us either, really. I mean, if you read books, you might figure it out, but people didn't tell us this. Why didn't you tell us this? We had no idea we were telling the same story and that we were bound by a common experience and that our families who had fled the South to flee racial oppression and economic oppression to feel a little more free and comparatively safe, we didn't know we were part of that same story. So, and we know that the Great Migration was about that, right? That about 7 million African Americans left the South to go north in search of opportunity between 1916 and 1970, in pretty much two waves. And their roads outmatched the closest interstates to their homes. So it's no wonder that my Mississippi-born dad hopped in a car right after graduating Velma Jackson High School, and he zipped up I-55 to Chicago to work in some factories and eventually start his own business, a body shop. And that's why my childhood friends with Alabama roots likely took 75 to get to Detroit, where we took pride in our family's work ethic and potential for upward mobility and the cultural imprint of our presence in those cities, the Black presence in those cities, especially our impact on the music and the arts, and of course, the political landscape. Isabel Wilkerson beautifully describes these journeys in The Warmth of Other Suns, as you all know. And she tells Great Migration stories of people like Ida Mae, Brandon Gladney. And when I read that book, I'm like, this book is my family. My mother could have just narrated it. I asked my father, Charlie Douglas, what it was like growing up in rural Mississippi and what compelled him to leave. And he told me a couple of things. I asked him to describe what it was like growing up. I wanted to capture it. I wanted to capture it in his voice. And I wanted him to tell me about why he left. So this is what life was like, according to my dad, Mr. Charlie Douglas.
There was no 9, 10 o'clock being up. Because there wasn't no radio, no TVs and stuff like that to be watching. So you work during the days and you sleep at night.
So that's what it was like growing up in North Madison County. And here's what he said about what it's like to work.
I didn't like carving wood, and I didn't like farming. Carving, you had to be climbing on top of building, nail and nail, you be hitting your finger and stuff. It's not like now they got air hammers and stuff like that. But,
Well, that's my dad. Now, as many of you likely know, the Great Migration actually occurs in two parts. The second migration began roughly around World War II when 1.5 million African Americans decided to leave again. I learned through researching my book on the official civil rights trail in the South that Black soldiers came home expecting that their sacrifice for our nation and the world would result in better treatment at home, but that was far from the truth. I think of Isaac Woodard with this story. Just hours after he returned home from the war, still in uniform, he was blinded by a racist attack by South Carolina police on February 12, 1946. So I know because of the repressive nature of Southern society at the time, these soldiers cast a wide net for something that looked like freedom and opportunity. Think about the children of people like this, people like me. I don't think I'm a child though, but I want to be. Can I go back? Kids weaned on stories of family and ritual and traditions grounded far, far away. Because the story of the South isn't this one-dimensional tale of everything that could go wrong either, right? There's a lot of goodness here. This is why we keep coming back, forth and back and forth. For Black Americans, the South is where the heart is. It's home. So I was actually talking a few years ago with Ida B. Wells' great-granddaughter, Michelle Duster, and she was telling me about the first time she visited Holly Springs, and she recalls her family like being outside waiting on her. She was so surprised, having grown up in Chicago, of having people out front waiting on you, being so welcoming. And she said they were so open, warm, and generous, and ready to feed her. And it was like the best feeling ever. And that's what it feels like for me when I come home to the South. Cousins I hardly know, I've met here and there over the course of the years, and we're meeting each other again, almost brand new each time. They actually treat me like a sister. One time in my 20s, when I came down here to work at the Clarion Ledger with Emily and Sarah, I was up in North Madison County at my grandmother's house, waiting for her to get back from an errand so I could visit. And so my cousins were playing basketball outside in the front, in the nice red Mississippi clay dirt, dusting up, getting all over everything. And my cousin said, "Oh, no, wait. No, you can't do this. We can't get you dirty. We can't dirty you up. Annie won't like that." So I thought it was so sweet and lovely to be cherished in that way, even though they wouldn't let me play. All this gets to a point I like to make about those stories that made up the connective tissue of our lives up north. And in our Great Lake migration locations like Kansas City, where I've also lived, and in Cleveland, where I have really good friends, and St. Louis, where I also have family, and many, many other places. We were all dislocated from place. How do you know who you are when you don't know where you come from? Despite the similarity of our stories, we didn't even know we were dislocated. In big cities of the North, it was common for us to behave more like immigrants. We served as a mutual support to get in, around, and through systems, institutions, school, If somebody was hungry, neighborhood moms would collect and barter or trade government commodities to make sure that nobody's family went unfed. And there was a phone tree for everything. And it was nothing to adopt a whole other family and gain a whole new set of play cousins. I mean, really, I have people who I'm not related to in any way, shape, or form, except that we consider each other family. And I didn't know that any of this had anything to do with our displacement from moving south to north. I just thought it was what folks did for one another and how they cared for each other. It was common to hear things like this, like, "Oh, because we're from Alabama, or because we're from Georgia, or because we're from Mississippi, we do things like this, and not that way." Or Sunday dinner. Think about Sunday dinner. Think about it. That's from the Four-Way Grill. That's what I eat when I go there in Memphis. Bespoke macaroni and cheese recipes. This is the kind of thing that we were concerned about. Collard greens, sweet potato pie, and the classic question, who made the potato salad? Holding on to traditions and rituals became somehow important for maintaining a sense of linkage to a time of deep connection and community. And sometimes it could come off as like you're putting on airs, like my way is better than your way because I'm from Georgia. But I'm like, no, my way is better because I'm from Mississippi. My family's from Mississippi. So, they acted like because they had a particular way of doing things based on an idea or an inkling of where they came from. It wasn't even like we really knew. It's like we're just absorbing these stories and then, building it up from there. The history of the Great Migration informs this sense of dislocation, of not knowing your name or where you're from. You don't know who your ancestors are. You're shrouded in mystery. Now, sometimes people think you can tell a story anywhere. But stories that are without a place, it's really hard to know what they mean at all, without that sense of place. And so I write in my book, in the preface, that I grew up in the remnant era of the civil rights movement. And I like to refer to it that way because there was something in the era of my childhood that was pregnant with energy and opportunity, but also of longing for home. I was too young to actually remember the uprisings in Detroit or see news of other uprisings. I don't call them riots, I call them uprisings in places like Watson, Newark. But even at 5, I knew something was different. I could feel change in the air even though I was too young to know what we were changing from. I just knew that this ain't it, and it's going to be something else. I figured out that some of it had to do with Blackness. You know how you're a kid and you're absorbing the messages? And when I visited my father's shop over many weekends during the year, that Greyhound bus, Detroit to Chicago, I noticed that he had these cardboard cutouts of famous Black thought leaders lined up on the file cabinets in his office. And it was there that I studied the countenance of Frederick Douglass, and I learned the name Harriet Tubman, and I saw Mary McLeod Bethune and so many others. And then what Black household didn't have pictures of Martin Luther King Jr., President Kennedy, and Jesus? Okay, Kennedy and King I get, but white Jesus, I don't know. It seemed kind of intrusive to me, especially my aunt's picture of Jesus knocking on a window of a high-rise. I'm like, oh, Jesus. So, long story short, I began to cobble together an identity informed by these people. They were so inspirational to me. They looked like me, and because most families I knew had encyclopedias in their home, remember those? I could read about them to my heart's content. And without being told, I figured out that my mission in life was to do meaningful work like they did to make people's lives better. I also like the idea of democracy. And I think I learned about that first time in 2nd grade. I'm like, this democracy thing, I could do this. And I naively thought that they solved the problems. These people, because of their work, solved all the problems. And that it was my job to be their wildest dream and live out what they made possible. So I know later on I'd be challenging that assumption, but that's beside the point. So today, I am the co-editor-in-chief of The Emancipator, which reimagines the nation's first abolitionist newspaper, founded in 1820 in Jonesboro, Tennessee. The Emancipator is will be in 2 weeks, April 25th, a digital platform that will launch on April 25th as a collaboration between Boston University and the Boston Globe, which really kind of makes sense because that great northeastern city was the hub of abolitionism. It's where William Lloyd Garrison published The Liberator, and people like Black abolitionist Mariah Stewart called for freedom and full inclusion in society. We're still working on that. In reimagining an outlet that called for the end of slavery, we are calling for the end of systemic racism and our commentary for a deeply evidence-based platform. Now, we know that's a tall order, but we think that by providing the missing context in the public conversation, the kind of commentary that identifies systemic problems and potential solutions that are being tested, we can do better because we'll know better. This work and my work has everything to do with those early stories and those years on the road going back and forth between Chicago, Detroit, Memphis, and Jackson. And the revelation that I received while researching my book traveling here in Little Rock and places like Atlanta, Selma, Birmingham, Montgomery, Farmville, Virginia. It's one of shifting from being a passive observer of history and transformation to being an active participant in the story of America. When I traveled to Selma, I learned of Amelia Boynton, who started organizing for Black voting rights as far back as the 1930s, or Georgia Gilmore, who raised money for the Montgomery bus boycott with her good cooking. I can do that, I can cook stuff. But I felt like a slacker. Barbara Johns exercised her agency as a student when she organized a school walkout for better conditions, and the case ended up being folded into Brown v. Board, which just desegregated public schools. I went to a lot of these homes while I was doing my research. I'm like, they're here, right in the neighborhood. I could touch, I could walk where they walk, sit in their porch. It's like, this history is not so far from us. So while politicians are having fits over what they're calling critical race theory, which is definitely not being taught in K-12 schools, many students are not learning about the righteous actions of student activists like Barbara Johns. And so these disjointed stories allow the truth to fall through the cracks, and we miss out on knowing what we're truly capable of doing. In visiting the homes of powerful people who moved the movement, people who built families and got their education, I was overwhelmed by what they were able to accomplish. Think about it: voting rights, housing rights, public accommodations, me and Emily kicking it like we do, and Sunday dinner. And these people have been under my nose my entire life. History of the highest order has really just been a matter of walking down the street or catching a bus or two to see the home that Emmett Till lived in. It's now being turned into a house museum, but I had no real consciousness that his home, which is like the next neighborhood over from where I lived for many years, was just right there. I didn't know, or I didn't purpose myself to know, to make the connection until I started my research, realizing that we all have the power to do this, to implicate ourselves and position ourselves in these narratives to help us decide what side of history we're going to stand on. The Evers home in Jackson is both a powerful symbol, but also a reminder of the everydayness of taking responsibility for your life and your family and your community. So I've always moved around with this air of privilege that was brought to me by these people. I knew that, but I just assumed that, okay, I'm going to take this thing and build great things with it. They gave me the sense that I could be anything or do anything, even if systemically speaking, we're not quite there yet. Think Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. For so long, I missed one thing. I am these people. They're not people in history books. I am these people. You are these people. I'm the hero of my story. You're the hero of this story, if you want to be. That's one of my heroes. A couple heroes I met during my research. Gloria, her family sued in the town of Shaw up north and went to the Supreme Court, and they won. And Dr. Timla Washington, you got to put a handle on that. She grilled me before accepting me, but now we're really great friends. Now, this cultural moment we find ourselves in forces me to contemplate what all this means. The desperate impacts on marginalized people from the coronavirus pandemic was a revelation to many, but not me, and not to many of you. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the fate of so many others extinguished by our nation's approach to policing as an occupying force in Black communities and not as a protective one, forces us to reconcile the nature of community and belonging and citizenship. Those very things that sent Black people running up north in the first place. Suddenly, those disjointed stories of where we came from mean so much more to me. Being disconnected from place, despite how hard our families work to maintain the connection, robs you of your shared story, robs us of our shared story. Disconnection from place can rob you of your humanity. Now, what does this mean, actually? The last 2.5 years, we've been in dual pandemics, one of social injustice and the coronavirus pandemic. And this demonstrably changed the Black community. This is real and it cannot be dismissed. We're in a culture that does not sleep. We are steeped in nonstop information and misinformation and foolishness. And while acknowledging the stress and real impacts of our time, we're facing a different brand of stress previous generations were used to. Dr. Inger Burnett Ziegler writes about it in her book, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, The Emotional Lives of Black Women. There's no equivalency to what our civil rights and Great Migration forebears went through, but there's also no respite without action. These are things that I'm afraid of. Walking through life on automatic, without generations, like my new baby cousin Jace, or Cadence, who just entered the world last week, not fully knowing and respecting where we came from and why it matters as individuals and families and communities. And as a nation that my people helped build, we did a good job of being so disconnected from a larger story of organizing, activism, and citizenship that we don't reclaim our birthright by actually voting. You know, for those of us who still can, we need to do it. And doing everything we can to protect that and the right to a living wage and education and healthcare, dignity. I'm afraid we will do what those who came before us didn't do, get too tired and to do something. But these things give me hope, too. This place we're standing in, a place for context and connection. I'm hopeful that marking the spots on the civil rights trail here and beyond will give a new generation a sense of place and purpose. I'm hopeful that the road goes both ways, and so many of us who left the Great Migration will find our way back. I'm grateful to know that whenever I dip south of the Mason-Dixon line, I am home. Now, what does this call on us to do? With hindsight and the privilege of traveling for the sole purpose of understanding and narrating a key period of the Black experience, one thing is clear to me now. We no longer have to be mere spectators to history. History is us. Thank you. So we are open for questions, and Chris will run crisscross back and forth around the room.
That's right.
If you have some questions to ask.
If you'll raise your hand, we'll bring the mic to you. Deirdre Payne is not here today. Normally Deirdre is my go-to for a first question. Tony, you're gonna have to come up with one.
Can you talk to us a little more about the history of the original emancipator, and who was it all written by the founder, or were there others who wrote for it?
In the archives I've seen, first of all, Elihu Embry founded the original emancipator, and it only published for a few issues before Elihu got sick, and he couldn't do it anymore. Now, there are versions of the emancipator that propped up later, like in the 1830s, but it wasn't the same emancipator that was operated by Elihu, who was a member of the Manumission Society in that part of the state of Tennessee. In the archives that I've looked at, I've seen writings from the Manumission Society. We're actually going to annotate the opening statement the day that we go live, in addition to annotations of other day ones of other abolitionist newspapers like the Liberator and the North Star. And the thing about the emancipator, the original emancipator, is that I actually get people who write me and say, that wasn't the first abolitionist newspaper. Now, I work at a university, and my boss is Ibram X. Kendi, Mr. Anti-Racist himself, historian, and I work in the Center for Anti-Racist Research, surrounded by other historians, so they've done the research. And so there's another abolitionist paper that was published before the Emancipator called The Philanthropist. And the Philanthropist, I think it was published in Ohio, and the Philanthropist, they included abolitionism as part of a menu of things that they advocated for or against. And if you look at their pattern of publishing, they may have published about abolitionism every 2 weeks or so. But the original Emancipator was buck wild. It was about ending slavery all day, every day, right now, get it done. And so that's what we're about.
I have a question about the book. Will you tell us a little bit about the trail itself and how you sort of decided
Yes.
where to start, where to end, and what to see?
Okay, so people who want to write books always ask me how I got the book contract. So I will tell you to tell the young people in your life that it helps to not be a jerk all your entire life, because people will remember how you treated them, and they will come back to you, and they will offer you an opportunity to have an opportunity. And so a writer who actually wrote for me for many years, who became my friend, wrote travel books, and she realized that Moon Travel was going to publish this book, and she thought we need to have the right person who is situated in place to write the book. And so actually I had to compete. I had to develop a proposal and give them an idea of why my version of the Civil Rights Trail, the official Civil Rights Trail, would be different from the other people vying to write this book. And so, and the opportunity came about because a group of Southern travel offices got together and realized that they were telling the civil rights story separately, but not together, and they could tell a much powerful story if they told it together. So they designated an official civil rights trail, and it's more than a marketing thing. There are many universities and people attached to the Department of Interior at different points who contributed to the foundations of what will become this official trail that was designated officially in 2018 and is constantly having new sites added to it. And this particular official trail is in the South. It doesn't mean that important civil rights work didn't happen elsewhere, because everybody I met wanted me to write their very own specific civil rights story. And I'm like, there is no book big enough to write the whole story. And so I decided in making my selections, I needed to capture a cohesive narrative arc of the mid-century civil rights movement. And I'm really careful to say mid-century civil rights movement, because Black people have always fought for civil rights before the mid-century civil rights movement and after the civil rights movement, even now. We call it social justice, but it's the same thing. And so my first place I researched was Mississippi, because, I come home and we know all the things that happen here. And it's foundational. It's actually catalytic in terms of creating the movement, the mid-century movement. So of course I had to come to Mississippi, all parts Mississippi. I had to go to Alabama, Montgomery bus boycott. I had to go to Selma, right? I need to touch Brown in some sort of way, in a meaningful way. So I went to Little Rock and I went to Farmville. All roads lead to DC, right? Congress makes the laws. The Supreme Court upholds the laws or helps to make new laws that will allow us to do things, hopefully. Cross your fingers. And even the city of Washington, D.C., the district itself, has a unique civil rights story. So I couldn't cover the entire official civil rights trail in the South, but I tried to put together a cohesive narrative arc that would capture it in a meaningful way. And of course, Memphis is in there. Yeah.
When you asked if anyone could remember the first stories that they had heard about the Great Migration.
Yes.
I thought about my Aunt Aura, who said that they left the plantation to go where things were better. They lived in a drafty old house on the plantation, and they just knew from reading the Chicago Defender
Yes.
that they were going to get a job at the slaughterhouse, move into a flat that was warm and cozy, and it wasn't like that.
No.
They lived in a flat that was about 3 stories high. They had to walk upstairs, and they shared a bathroom that everyone in the flat shared, and that the folk who were already there accused them of coming to take their jobs.
Yep.
So instead of being welcomed and feeling more safe than they had been on the plantation, it did not turn out that way at all.
Right?
But she recalled having to stay in Mississippi until my Uncle Plummer, that was not his name, that's what she called him, came to pick her up. And I could identify with the lunch. She said she packed her lunch in a shoebox.
Yes.
A shoebox that came from Walter Field's catalog with some cheap shoes in them. Well, that's beside the point. If it came from Walter Field, you know they were cheap shoes. But anyway, she said that she had chocolate cake, some fried chicken, and I can't think of what the other thing was. But the bag was greasy, and she knew that when she got off that Greyhound bus, that she was going to be safely in Chicago. But she said they had trouble getting on the bus because the plantation owner had heard that they were all leaving, and they had folk there to deter their travel. It was a mess the way she told it.
Yeah, that's true.
So any account of the Great Migration that does not cover that, for me, is not the whole story.
I would not want to make it seem like the North was this utopia at all, because it was not. And a lot of what you just described still plays out today in the housing crisis. It still plays out today in the interpersonal relations in the workplace. And people don't really realize the deep roots of how they relate or fail to relate with each other, but it really goes back to what you're describing. So you are exactly right. Thank you.
We have a question from the live stream. Vicki Roberts-Ratliff asks if there's a way to add sites to the trail. Is there any sort of online presence for it, or does it?
Yes, you need to contact Travel South. They're in Alabama, and they're in charge of what gets added, and there is a process that you have to go through, and it can happen. Okay, and after you go her, then she's in the back. Okay.
You started today with a poem from Langston Hughes, and you mentioned Isabel Wilkerson. You also mentioned some of the music and culture, but what other kinds of art do you feel like has been informed by the Great Migration, or are there other things that you could recommend to us if we want to learn more about some of the complexities? Because it's not one story.
Yeah. Off the top of my head, I don't have like a whole list of things. You definitely need to read Isabel's book, but I have a list of resources in the back of the book because I felt like this can't possibly capture enough for people to get enough. And the thing about everything that you can read is you're going to be excited by it. You're going to learn so much more about the American project. And as you were just speaking, ma'am, I was thinking about Etan McHaley's book on the Defender. And he talks about some of the situations that you described, how it wasn't this perfect place that people landed in, and it wasn't necessarily a welcoming place for Black people. And so I definitely would say Etan's book on the Chicago Defender is a really great place to start. Oh, I always like to say the Pullman Porters were the original social media.
Well, I'm not going to ask a question. I'd like to say a few statements, please.
Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for all that you do, and continue to do that. That's one statement. My other statement is, I'm not fond of the South, but I'm learning that Mississippi is really working hard to try to change some of the differences or what happened in the past. And it's not as I can't even think of the word, but I was born and raised in Louisiana, in a little town called St. Martinville, Louisiana. And my parents died when I was very young, so I didn't migrate, or my family didn't migrate. But I, as a child, because of all the stories I would hear, I knew that I would leave someday. However, I didn't want to go to the place that I knew that some of the other people had gone and come back and said it was so desolate, like she was saying. So I did what I did through education. I went to college in Louisiana, but then as I moved, I went from Oklahoma to New York and then to California. So I guess I did migrate, but I didn't migrate for the same kind of reasons. I just knew that I wanted to be, I thought that education would do it. But I have a daughter who works for the, what is the name of your company again? I forget. The Department of Archives and History, I forgot. And she's doing what I think probably I would have done if I had the same mindset. Her mindset is just terrific because she now lives in Mississippi and works for Mississippi, and she has never known Mississippi. Of course, when we came back to visit other family in Louisiana, then of course she would come with me and she would just observe and observe the older people talking. And of course now I'm one of those older people. But I am so happy that Mississippi is doing what it's doing. Very much so, and thank you.
Thank you so much. It's funny, I was, Emily, remember that time you were covering the opening of the casinos in Biloxi? And I hung out with Emily that day. Actually got old men from Chicago who came down on buses to buy me drinks all day while she was reporting. But Emily was living in Ocean Springs, lived in this beautiful house. And ever since then, I have this vision in my mind that I'll retire to a place as beautiful as that. So I haven't quit Mississippi.
Yes, you mentioned some other areas in which the Great Migration was portrayed. Jacob Lawrence did a whole series on that in New York City.
Thank you for evoking that, yes.
Yeah.
I got to see some of his work
Right.
at the Art Museum in Charleston.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a book, yeah.
Thank you. 300 or 400 pages, he said, but I'm sure it's beautiful of his art.
Thank you again for your work and being here. I'm actually in the process of reading Stamped from the Beginning. And I'm on like chapter 23 or 25, something like that, I can't remember. But it's a lot, right? And you think about the journey of African Americans from the South to the North, and you think of places like the Greenwood community in Tulsa, and you think of other places where black safe havens were taken advantage of or destroyed, and black people moving north, west, east for safe haven. And then as the young woman said, that things just wasn't what they had planned out to be. So I guess this is like a bleak question, but is there, or have you, through your research, a true safe space for African Americans, like a true safe haven? Because even now in communities that have been black for a long period of time, now they're being gentrified and people are being forced out of their homes. And you spoke about the housing crisis in the North. So maybe it's not a question you can answer, but it just came to my head, like, is there a true safe space for African Americans to be free in America?
Well, this whole nation of safe spaces vexes me. I've written about it, and I don't necessarily believe in safe spaces. I believe in brave spaces. Not necessarily safe spaces, but I think that's why connection and community and a sense of place matters, so that whenever you find yourself in a situation where you feel threatened, whether psychically or physically, that you know where you belong and who you belong to. I think that is the calculus that we all engage with every day. You know, my publishing company is in San Francisco, so it's an office full of liberal young white people. And so my editor, I love her, Nikki, she was asking me, should we put something in here about black people traveling in the South? Should we do a certain page about, you know, where you can go and where you can't go and what you can do? I'm like, Nikki, this is America. I can't tell them anything they already don't know. I will not infantilize my community and condescend to them by writing something like that. We know what time it is.
I have two questions. One is, I lived in the Mississippi Delta for a while. Actually, was the only white girl in my class. But a lot of them talked about Detroit. A lot of them talked about Chicago. Are there spots, you mentioned Shaw, you mentioned Emmett Till's house. Are there spots to visit in the Mississippi Delta? That's question number one.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, the migration pattern. You said there are two surges. I'd like to know the specific kind of era they came in, and did it train? I always envisioned it following the train track up that way, and I know the interstates came in after World War II. What mode of transportation did they generally take in each wave?
I know of trains, I know of cars. I couldn't pinpoint what years or waves that went in through what modes of transportation, but I'm aware of that. And also I'm aware of the fact that for some people it was difficult for them to leave, like they had to sneak away. I've known people who had to sneak away. Lots of places in the Delta. Lots of places associated with Emmett's story, the courthouse, the ruins of Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market. There's the Emmett Till Interpretive Center. There's the Emmett Till Intrepid Center. There's the Fannie Lou Hamer Memorial Park in Ruleville. And then you have all the things going on culturally, like with the Blues Museum, B.B. King's Blues Museum, and other things like that. And that's all delineated in the book. You could go up there and have a sacred and profane time.
You mentioned San Francisco, and I spent a number of years living in the San Francisco Bay Area. And you also, when you were talking about people migrating to the West, during World War II, there were a lot of people who came, and they were building the Liberty ships in Sausalito, Marin ship, and they built temporary housing for the people who they had recruited from the Deep South to come, but they expected them all to go home once the war was over, and they didn't. They stayed, and there are a number of places. Marin County has Marin City, which is a ghetto of its own, though people who live in Richmond are jealous of the people that live in Marin City.
Yeah.
And I was just mentioning that because there were a lot of obstacles, and there were a lot of different reasons that people migrated.
Yeah.
But they stayed.
It's funny, back to the other woman's question about the interstates, the one thing I kept bumping up against in my research is I'd go to a town, I would go to the historic black part of town, and they would go, we used to do this, or we danced here, oh, people went out on Saturday night and they dated here, oh, we had this great fun, this was bustling. And I would always ask, well, what happened to it? Well, what happened to it? And invariably, the interstate came and plowed right through the community, like more than one community. It was like a thing, and then I started doing more reading, and I realized that there was like no system of like public hearings for people to even be heard about, not having the interstate tear through their communities. And I found out that the interstates were built upon the redlining maps first established in the 1930s, and that's still playing out today. I actually have a copy of my own redlining map where I was born on my computer over there, because I wanted to know what they predicted about my outcomes based on where I was born on the west side of Chicago, and how that's playing out. Did my zip code become my destiny, or did it not?
Debbie, are you ever concerned about the romanticizing of the serious economic and cultural conditions that were an integral part of the Great Migration, and the romanticization of poverty, the attempt to escape from poverty, more or less unsuccessfully in a lot of ways. And these trails, the Civil Rights Trail, the Great Migration Trail, whatever, reminds me of, there was a fad 10 years ago, maybe a little more, for the Underground Railroad. Everybody was establishing the sites on the Underground Railroad. A kind of commodification of culture in these waves allows, I think, that the capitalist need to make money allows the cultivation of so many different tales that could warp the meaning of the cultural experience.
Yeah. Well, right on, Dave. All of that. It's funny. It's like I live in tension with it because I wrote a book, which is I'm commercializing the experience, right? But at least I'm commercializing my own experience, and I'm being a careful caretaker of the story and writing with love, and I'm working hard to avoid deficit framing the Black community in a way that other people who don't have ownership or a right to speak into the story may have. And it's not lost on me that a lot of the people who are marketing and promoting the Civil Rights Trail and other trails would only be in it for the ability to make money off of it. But I'm also heartened by the prospect of seeing my story, my people's story told in a large way, of not being what I call depresenced. It's a word that I invented, and the way I define it is that it's a very specific way that white cis patriarchy has of avoiding or acknowledging the humanity, the heat, or the physicality and spaces of Black women, but that could be extrapolated. And it's different from erasure, because erasure requires you to be there in the first place in order to be erased. There's a certain kind of way that a certain kind of white male ethos has of never acknowledging you in the first place. And you're saying, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, and I'm ready to do the work, and I'm doing all the things, and I'm trying to do this thing. And so I'm so glad that at least the story can be told and that we can be seen in the story. And I think by having a Black writer like me write this travel book, because most travel writers are not Black, it allows us to be a caretaker and usher people in on this journey in a way that is most appropriate. Okay. Did I do it, Professor?
We have copies of the book for sale over here, and it is an excellent book. We also have copies of the evaluation form for the Humanities Council. If you don't mind, take a moment and grab one of these here, or strategically placed over by the cookies and coffee. Fill that out and leave it anywhere. We'll pick it up. I hope that we see you back here Friday at 2 for Piccoli Woodsy, Carla Shedd, and the others. And I hope that we see you back here next Wednesday when Thomas Curson will talk about Mississippi communes and counterculture. But for today, help me thank Deborah Douglas for this fantastic program.
Thanks, everybody.